Canada is often described as a competitive, well-regulated economy, yet many everyday costs suggest something very different is happening beneath the surface. Groceries, phone plans, banking fees, air travel, and even basic utilities consistently cost more in Canada than in comparable countries. This is not simply the result of geography, inflation, or bad management. It is largely the outcome of market concentration combined with regulatory protection. Over decades, a small number of firms came to dominate essential sectors, and instead of being challenged, they were stabilized, consolidated, and shielded in the name of efficiency and national interest. These companies are not operating illegally in most cases. They operate exactly as the system allows them to. When competition is limited, prices no longer fall through market pressure. Instead, they settle at the highest level consumers are willing or forced to tolerate. This structure quietly shifts economic power away from households and toward institutions that control supply, access, and pricing. Consumers may feel like they have choices, but those choices often exist within the same corporate networks. Different brands, same owners, different plans, same pricing logic. Regulation, which is meant to protect the public, frequently ends up protecting incumbents by raising barriers for new entrants. Over time, this creates an economy where efficiency is defined as stability rather than affordability. Costs become sticky, profits become predictable, and accountability becomes diffuse. The result is not a single villain, but a pattern repeated across industries. Understanding this pattern matters because it explains why temporary relief rarely lasts and why public frustration keeps rising without structural change. Once you see how protection and concentration interact, Canada's cost of living stops feeling accidental and starts looking systemic. This pattern repeats across sectors, and once it becomes visible, it changes how every major expense is understood. One of the clearest examples of protected concentration in Canada appears in the grocery sector, where a handful of corporations dominate food distribution nationwide. Loblaws, Empire, and Metro collectively control most major grocery chains, warehouses, and private label brands. This level of concentration gives them enormous leverage over suppliers, logistics, and shelf access. Farmers and food producers often face take-it-or-leave-it terms because losing access to these networks can mean losing the market entirely. While stores appear competitive through sales and branding, pricing behavior tends to move together rather than independently. When costs rise, prices increase quickly. When costs fall, prices rarely follow at the same speed. This asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects bargaining power. Grocery margins may look small individually, but at scale, they translate into significant profits. Vertical integration allows these companies to control everything from sourcing to retail, limiting transparency and reducing outside pressure. Discount chains and alternative brands often belong to the same parent companies, creating the illusion of choice without real competition. Regulatory oversight exists, but it focuses on price fixing rather than structural dominance. As long as companies avoid explicit collusion, concentration remains largely unchallenged. During inflationary periods, grocery chains often attribute increases to external shocks, yet prices tend to remain elevated long after those shocks ease. Consumers absorb the difference because food is non-negotiable. This makes groceries a reliable profit center even in economic downturns. The system rewards stability and scale, rather than affordability or innovation. Over time, food pricing becomes less about efficiency and more about tolerance. This matters because groceries are a baseline expense. When they become structurally expensive, pressure spreads through household budgets everywhere. Once food costs are locked in this way, every other essential industry follows the same logic. Another major pillar of Canada's protected economy is telecommunications, an industry dominated by three firms that control most wireless, internet, and infrastructure access nationwide. Bell, Rogers, and Telus operate within a tightly regulated environment that limits foreign competition and raises barriers for new domestic entrants. While this structure is often justified by geography and infrastructure costs, similar countries with large land areas manage far lower prices through stronger competition. In Canada, The big providers own critical infrastructure such as towers, fiber lines, and spectrum licenses, allowing them to dictate wholesale access terms to smaller carriers. This means even discount brands ultimately rely on the same networks and pricing logic. Promotional plans appear periodically, but long-term pricing remains remarkably aligned across providers. Data caps stay low, overage fees remain high, and service improvements lag behind global peers. Regulatory intervention tends to focus on incremental adjustments rather than structural change, preserving stability instead of affordability. Consumers face switching costs that discourage movement, reinforcing loyalty through inconvenience rather than value. The result is one of the highest average mobile and internet costs in the developed world. Telecom pricing matters because connectivity is no longer optional. It affects work, education, healthcare, and social participation. When access is expensive, inequality deepens quietly. This sector demonstrates how protection works in practice. Companies operate legally, profits remain predictable, and public frustration becomes normalized. Innovation happens slowly because competition pressure is weak. The system favors incumbents who already control access points. Over time, high prices stop feeling temporary and become accepted as inevitable. This acceptance is powerful because it trains consumers to expect overpayment. Once communication is priced this way, it sets expectations for other industries. The telecom model shows how essential services can be monetized aggressively when competition is constrained and oversight prioritizes continuity over consumer relief. When connection itself becomes expensive, the idea of fair pricing quietly disappears. Banking represents another cornerstone of Canada's protected economy, shaped by a small group of institutions that dominate lending, payments, and household finance. The Big Five banks control most mortgages, credit cards, deposits, and business lending, creating a system where competition exists largely in branding rather than pricing. Canada intentionally limits foreign bank entry and large-scale challenges to preserve financial stability, but that stability comes with higher fees and slower innovation. Interest rates, service charges, and account structures tend to move together, leaving consumers with few meaningful alternatives. During housing booms, banks benefit from rising asset values and expanding debt, while risk is spread across borrowers and the broader economy. When conditions tighten, these institutions are treated as systemically important and therefore protected from failure. This arrangement encourages caution rather than disruption. Financial technology firms do emerge, but most operate within the same rails or are absorbed before they threaten core profits. For households, banking costs are embedded and unavoidable, tied to housing, savings, and daily transactions. The system rewards predictability over competition, reinforcing the same players decade after decade. Because banks sit at the center of credit creation, their pricing power shapes the entire economy. Expensive borrowing influences housing affordability, business expansion, and consumer resilience. Yet reform efforts tend to focus on consumer education rather than structural change. Over time, banking becomes another example of how protection normalizes higher costs in exchange for perceived safety. Once credit itself is concentrated, the economy grows more sensitive to the decisions of a few institutions, and that sensitivity extends into every major financial choice Canadians make. This concentration quietly links personal finances to institutional priorities, reducing flexibility for households during economic stress and long-term planning. Banking protection completes the picture by showing how risk and cost concentrate together systemically nationwide. Air travel in Canada provides another clear example of how protection and concentration shape everyday costs. The domestic airline market is dominated by two major carriers, Air Canada and WestJet, which control most profitable routes, airport slots, and passenger volume. While smaller airlines exist, they face high barriers in the form of airport fees, limited access to gates, and cost structures that make long-term competition difficult. This concentration allows ticket prices to remain high, even when planes are full and demand is strong. Canadians often pay more to fly between cities within their own country than to travel internationally over longer distances. These prices are frequently justified by geography and fuel costs, yet comparable countries manage broader coverage at lower average fares. Airlines are treated as strategic national assets, meaning their survival is prioritized over price competition. During crises, public support and bailouts help stabilize carriers, but during profitable periods, savings rarely pass through to passengers. Additional fees for baggage, seat selection, and changes further inflate travel costs, turning base fares into only part of the final price. Airports themselves operate as local monopolies, adding layers of charges that are ultimately passed to travelers. This system reduces mobility, limits regional integration, and raises costs for businesses and families alike. Air travel becomes a discretionary luxury rather than an accessible service. The lack of sustained competition removes pressure to innovate on pricing or service quality. Over time, consumers adjust expectations downward, accepting high costs as unavoidable. This mirrors patterns seen in other protected sectors, where stability is valued over affordability. Once movement itself becomes expensive, economic opportunity narrows quietly. The airline sector shows how protection extends beyond products into physical access, shaping how people connect across the country and how costs ripple through tourism trade and labor mobility nationwide. When mobility is priced this way, economic freedom quietly contracts across the entire system. Another less visible but deeply influential form of protection in Canada exists through supply management and government-controlled distribution systems, particularly in dairy, poultry, and alcohol. These sectors operate under strict quotas, price floors, and import restrictions that intentionally limit competition. Farmers must purchase expensive production quotas to participate, which locks out new entrants and embeds high costs into the system from the start. While the policy is framed as protecting rural stability and food security, the result for consumers is consistently higher prices with limited choice. Milk, cheese, and basic staples cost more than in countries with open markets, not because production is inefficient, but because supply is deliberately constrained. Alcohol distribution follows a similar pattern. Provincial liquor boards control wholesale pricing, retail access, and markups, acting as legal monopolies with guaranteed revenue streams. Selection is narrower, prices are higher, and innovation moves slowly. Because these systems generate predictable income for governments and protect established stakeholders, they are politically difficult to challenge. Trade negotiations repeatedly stall over these protections, yet domestic pressure for reform remains limited because costs are spread across millions of consumers rather than concentrated in visible bills. This diffusion reduces resistance. Unlike private monopolies, these structures operate with public legitimacy, making their economic impact harder to question. Over time, protection becomes normalized as policy rather than privilege. These systems demonstrate that monopoly power in Canada is not only corporate but institutional. The state itself can act as a market gatekeeper, shaping prices and access through regulation rather than ownership. This blurs the line between public interest and revenue generation. When essential goods are managed this way, affordability becomes secondary to control and predictability. The persistence of these models shows how deeply protection is embedded in economic design, not as an exception, but as a governing principle that quietly affects daily life across income levels and regions. At this point, protection no longer looks accidental, but systemic, woven into how markets are built. What makes Canada's monopolies especially durable is how they reinforce one another across the economy, rather than operating in isolation. High grocery prices push households to rely more on credit, benefiting banks. Expensive telecom bills normalize overpayment, making airline fees and service charges feel less shocking by comparison. When essentials are already costly, resistance to additional costs weakens. This creates a feedback loop where affordability declines, but expectations decline faster. Governments respond with temporary rebates, tax credits, or targeted relief, but rarely address structural concentration. These measures reduce pressure without changing incentives. Over time, Monopolies learn that public frustration can be managed politically without threatening market dominance. This reduces urgency for reform. Stability becomes the overriding priority because disruption risks short-term backlash. The narrative shifts toward external blame, such as global inflation, supply chains, or geography, while domestic market design goes largely unexamined. Canada did not arrive at this structure by accident. It chose predictability over competition, consolidation over experimentation, and national champions over fragmented markets. These choices made sense in earlier eras, but produce different outcomes in a globalized economy. Productivity growth slows, innovation concentrates, and consumers shoulder rising costs. Younger generations experience this as stagnation rather than progress. Businesses face higher input costs and fewer partners. Regions become more dependent on centralized providers. Yet the system appears orderly, which reduces political urgency. Monopolies do not need to exploit aggressively when protection does the work for them. The real cost is not only financial, but dynamic. Opportunity narrows quietly, while the economy appears stable on paper. Understanding this interaction is critical because it explains why reform feels elusive. Each sector points to another, and responsibility diffuses. Without confronting how these protections interlock, affordability remains a secondary concern. The system sustains itself by aligning incentives across institutions, corporations, and policy. Once this alignment sets in, change becomes difficult without coordinated action. When protection links sectors together, the entire economy starts moving in one rigid direction. The long-term consequences of this protected structure become clearer when looking at productivity, wages, and innovation across the Canadian economy. In competitive markets, firms are pressured to improve efficiency, lower prices, and innovate to survive. In protected markets, survival is less tied to performance and more to access and regulation. This reduces urgency to invest aggressively in productivity-enhancing technology or process improvement. Over time, output grows more slowly, while costs remain high. Wages struggle to keep pace because firms pass inefficiencies to consumers instead of fixing them internally. For workers, this creates a gap between effort and reward. For businesses outside protected sectors, high input costs reduce competitiveness both domestically and internationally. Startups face structural disadvantages because they must operate within ecosystems controlled by incumbents. Scaling becomes harder when distribution, financing, and access are concentrated. This discourages risk-taking and experimentation. Talented workers increasingly look abroad for better opportunities, contributing to quiet brain drain. The economy appears stable but underperforms its potential. Government policy often responds by supporting incumbents further to preserve jobs and continuity, reinforcing the same cycle. This creates a paradox where protection intended to ensure stability gradually undermines long-term growth. Productivity stagnation does not cause immediate crisis, which makes it politically easy to ignore. Instead, it slowly erodes living standards and future capacity. The cost shows up years later through lower growth, weaker innovation, and limited upward mobility. By the time effects become visible, structures are deeply entrenched. This dynamic explains why Canada can feel wealthy, yet increasingly unaffordable at the same time. Stability masks erosion. The system functions, but not optimally. Understanding this trade-off is essential because it reframes the debate. The question is not whether protection works, but who it works for and at what cost. Without addressing productivity and competition together, affordability issues persist, regardless of short-term fixes. Stability may look safe, but over time it quietly trades future growth for present comfort. Canada's regulatory culture plays a central role in sustaining monopolies because it prioritizes risk avoidance over competitive pressure. Regulators often focus on preventing failure rather than encouraging entry, which favors established firms with compliance resources. New competitors face lengthy approvals, high capital requirements, and complex rules that incumbents already navigated decades ago. This creates asymmetric friction, where protecting consumers paradoxically reduces choice. Consultation processes are dominated by large stakeholders who can afford sustained engagement, shaping outcomes subtly over time. Even well-intentioned policy tends to stabilize existing market structures instead of challenging them. Competition law is reactive, targeting explicit misconduct rather than concentration itself. As long as firms follow formal rules, market power remains untouched. This approach reflects a broader cultural preference for order and predictability. Disruption is treated as a risk rather than a source of improvement. Political leaders inherit this framework and rarely challenge it because change carries uncertain consequences. The result is incrementalism, where issues are acknowledged but deferred. Reports are commissioned, studies released, and recommendations softened. Meanwhile, costs remain embedded. This regulatory posture reinforces the belief that high prices are an unfortunate trade-off for stability. Over time, that belief hardens into common sense. Citizens adapt expectations downward, and reform loses urgency. The system becomes self-justifying because alternatives feel unfamiliar. Understanding regulation as a driver rather than a referee clarifies why monopolies persist without overt abuse. Power is maintained through process, not conspiracy. When rules favor continuity, outcomes follow predictably. Recognizing this mechanism is crucial because it shows that affordability is not blocked by a single policy, but by an entire mindset. Changing prices, therefore, requires changing how risk, competition, and success are defined across institutions. This dynamic shapes expectations and outcomes across generations nationwide. When stability becomes the goal, competition slowly disappears without announcement. Public frustration with high prices in Canada often rises during economic stress, yet it rarely translates into sustained pressure for structural reform. This is partly because the effects of monopolies are spread unevenly and felt gradually rather than through sudden shocks. Each sector adds a manageable burden on its own, but together they compound into a heavy cost of living. Because no single price increase feels decisive, anger dissipates before it organizes. Political responses tend to focus on visible relief rather than underlying causes. Rebates, temporary caps, and targeted subsidies offer short-term comfort while leaving market structure untouched. These measures also reduce urgency by signaling action without disruption. Over time, voters become conditioned to expect compensation rather than competition. This shifts the public conversation away from systemic design toward distribution. Who gets relief matters more than why costs are high in the first place. Monopolies benefit from this framing because it preserves their position, while governments manage symptoms. Media coverage often reinforces this cycle by focusing on price spikes rather than concentration. Complex structural issues receive less sustained attention because they lack simple narratives. This creates an information gap where causes are harder to trace than effects. As a result, accountability diffuses across institutions, corporations, and regulators. Everyone plays a role, which means no one feels solely responsible. This diffusion protects the system from decisive challenge. Understanding this dynamic explains why reform stalls even when dissatisfaction is widespread. Change requires sustained focus on structure, not episodic outrage. Without that focus, protected markets continue operating quietly in the background. Over time, normalization sets in. What once felt expensive becomes expected. Younger consumers enter the market with lower reference points, accepting costs as standard. This generational adjustment further reduces pressure for change. The system persists, not because people approve of it, but because the path to altering it feels abstract and distant compared to immediate concerns. Until structure becomes a mainstream issue, affordability debates remain incomplete. When frustration is managed instead of mobilized, systems rarely feel the need to change. Looking beyond individual sectors, Canada's monopoly structure also shapes how economic success is measured and discussed. Growth is often evaluated through stability metrics rather than competitiveness indicators. Low volatility, predictable profits, and institutional resilience are treated as signs of strength, even when affordability and productivity lag. This framing influences policy priorities. Governments emphasize maintaining confidence and preventing disruption, which aligns naturally with incumbent interests. When success is defined this way, reform becomes a risk rather than an objective. Businesses adapt accordingly, investing in regulatory navigation instead of innovation. Capital flows toward protected sectors because returns are reliable, not because they are efficient. This crowds out investment in areas that depend on open competition. Over time, the economy tilts toward rent extraction rather than value creation. Consumers feel this shift through rising prices and fewer breakthroughs. Workers feel it through slower wage growth and limited mobility. Yet official narratives remain optimistic because core institutions remain intact. This disconnect between lived experience and macro stability fuels quiet disillusionment. People sense something is off but struggle to identify the source. The structure rewards those who understand the system and penalizes those who rely on markets to function competitively. This creates inequality not only of income but of access. Economic outcomes become increasingly shaped by position rather than performance. The longer this persists, the harder it becomes to reverse because expectations adjust. Firms plan around protection. Workers adapt to limited choice. Policymakers inherit a system where change appears disruptive rather than corrective. Understanding this measurement problem matters because it explains why warning signs are often dismissed. When indicators are misaligned, problems can grow unnoticed. Canada's economy does not collapse under this model, it coasts. But coasting in a changing world carries hidden costs. The gap between potential and reality widens quietly. Recognizing how success is defined is the first step toward understanding why protection persists despite mounting pressure. As long as stability is mistaken for health, the system has little reason to evolve. As the effects of protection accumulate, the question naturally shifts from identifying the problem to understanding why reform remains so limited despite growing awareness. One reason is that breaking monopolies carries visible short-term costs, while benefits arrive slowly and unevenly. Increased competition can disrupt jobs, reduce profits, and unsettle markets before lowering prices. Policymakers face immediate backlash, while long-term gains are uncertain. This makes reform politically unattractive even when economically sound. Another barrier is coordination. Each protected sector argues that reform must start elsewhere to avoid imbalance. Airlines point to airports, telecoms point to infrastructure, banks point to global regulation, and grocery chains point to suppliers. Responsibility fragments across institutions, creating paralysis. Legal frameworks also move slowly. Competition cases take years, during which markets continue operating unchanged. By the time rulings arrive, structures are even more entrenched. Public attention shifts faster than policy cycles, allowing momentum to fade. Additionally, many protections are framed as safeguards rather than privileges, making reform feel risky. Stability narratives resonate strongly in uncertain times. Voters often prioritize predictability over price relief when choices appear binary. This creates a bias toward preserving existing arrangements. Even well-designed reforms are diluted during implementation to reduce disruption. Incremental changes soften impact but rarely alter incentives. Over time, the gap between rhetoric and outcome grows. Reform becomes performative rather than transformative. Understanding these barriers explains why awareness alone does not produce change. Systems persist because dismantling them requires sustained alignment between public pressure, political will, and institutional capacity. That alignment is rare without crisis. Until costs become impossible to ignore, gradual erosion continues quietly. Affordability declines while structures remain intact. This does not mean reform is impossible, only that it requires confronting trade-offs honestly, rather than deferring them indefinitely. Real change begins only when stability itself starts feeling unsafe. Comparing Canada's experience with other developed economies helps clarify that high prices are not an inevitable outcome of wealth or geography. Countries with similar income levels and regulatory capacity have chosen different paths that emphasize competition more aggressively. In parts of Europe, telecom markets support multiple cross-border operators, driving prices down through scale and rivalry. Grocery sectors allow stronger foreign entry, increasing pressure on margins. Banking systems tolerate more mid-sized competitors, giving consumers alternatives. These choices involve trade-offs, including higher volatility and occasional failures, but they also produce lower consumer costs and faster innovation. Canada deliberately avoided many of these risks by limiting entry and consolidating markets early. This reduced instability but increased concentration. The comparison matters because it shows that outcomes reflect policy priorities rather than constraints. Canada values continuity and domestic control, even if that means paying more. Other countries accept disruption to improve efficiency. Neither approach is perfect, but the cost differences are real. When Canadians pay more for essentials, it reflects a decision to protect incumbents and reduce uncertainty. This comparison also challenges the idea that reform would be uniquely dangerous. Other systems manage competition without collapse. The fear of change often exceeds the evidence. Understanding international alternatives reframes the debate from inevitability to choice. It becomes clear that monopolies persist because they align with national preferences for order and predictability. That alignment can change, but only if priorities shift. Looking outward breaks the illusion that Canada's model is the only workable one. It highlights paths not taken and options still available. This perspective matters because it grounds criticism in evidence rather than frustration. When people see that different outcomes are possible, tolerance for high costs weakens. Comparisons expose trade-offs honestly rather than abstractly. They show that affordability and stability are not mutually exclusive, but balancing them requires deliberate policy choices rather than default reliance on protection. Once alternatives are visible, the system stops feeling inevitable and starts looking optional. As awareness grows, the debate around Canada's monopolies increasingly centers on what meaningful reform would actually look like in practice. Breaking up firms is only one option, and often the least realistic. More effective change usually comes from opening access, lowering entry barriers, and enforcing competition rules consistently rather than symbolically. Allowing greater foreign participation, simplifying regulatory approval, and separating infrastructure ownership from service provision can introduce pressure without destroying institutions. These measures target behavior instead of size. However, implementing them requires a shift in mindset. Regulators must move from protecting incumbents to protecting outcomes such as affordability, innovation, and choice. This challenges long-standing assumptions about risk. Short-term instability becomes acceptable if long-term benefits are clear. Political leadership plays a critical role because reform requires absorbing early criticism in exchange for delayed gains. Public communication matters as well. When reforms are framed honestly, citizens are more willing to tolerate transition costs. Transparency reduces fear. Another key element is sequencing. Gradual but credible reform builds confidence, while vague promises do not. Markets respond to signals. If firms believe competition is coming, behavior changes even before rules take full effect. This can lower prices and improve service without dramatic intervention. Canada has the institutional capacity to pursue this path, but capacity alone is not enough. Incentives must change. As long as protection is rewarded politically and economically, reform stalls. The challenge is aligning consumer interests with policy priorities consistently over time. This alignment rarely happens overnight. It develops through sustained discussion, evidence, and pressure. Understanding reform as a process rather than an event clarifies why progress feels slow. But slow does not mean impossible. Systems adjust when incentives shift decisively. Until that happens, monopolies remain the rational outcome of existing rules. Recognizing this reframes frustration into strategy. The question is no longer whether change is needed, but what combination of pressure policy and patience can realistically produce it without destabilizing the economy Canadians rely on daily? When incentives change, behavior follows, and that is where real reform quietly begins. Canada's economy is not failing because it lacks resources or talent, but because its structure rewards protection over competition. Monopolies persist because rules, incentives, and political caution align to preserve them. That choice delivers short-term stability, yet slowly erodes affordability, productivity, and trust. Understanding this pattern changes the debate from anger to clarity. High prices are not random, and relief is not impossible, but meaningful change requires confronting how markets are designed. Competition does not mean chaos, and stability does not have to mean permanent overpayment. Countries that rebalance these forces regain flexibility without collapse. Canada faces the same choice. Whether reform happens depends on sustained public focus rather than temporary frustration. Systems shift only when incentives change and expectations follow. If this breakdown helped you see the structure more clearly, stay connected. More clear explanations, deeper system analysis, and long-term economic insights are coming very soon globally.